ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Valdai Club. And it is a great honor and privilege for me to welcome here one of the leading classics of theory of international relations. One of the leading classics of theory of international relations, one of the greatest realists living today on the same level as Edward Carr, Hans Morgenthau, and Kenneth Waltz, Dr. John Mearsheimer from Chicago University, the author of Offensive Realism. This is the theory that Dr. Mearsheimer defines. The offensive realism as a tool to analyze international relations. And we are very thankful for Dr. Mearsheimer, who is, by the way, generally in Moscow here for a course of lectures in GIMO University. And next year he's also visiting the Valdai conference in Sochi that the Valdai Club is organizing, which is also a great honor for us. Thank you. And Dr. Mearsheimer is one of the few and one of the most renowned American scholars and international scholars, global scholars, who argued from the very beginning that the idea of perpetual peace that was very popular after the end of the Cold War is rather an illusion than a rule, and that competition between great powers will not fade away, that international relations are by definition characterized by eternal great power competition. Actually, one of the greatest books that John Mearsheimer authored is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, in which he argues that great powers are also always fighting for strengthening, for hegemony, and this predetermines conflictual relations among them. And I would say at the onset that the current state of U.S.-Russian relations these days and the current state of the U.S.-Chinese relations these days proved John Mearsheimer right, as always. Now we're seeing that we are once again in an era of acute and outright great power rivalry. It is back. It is back, and this is a norm of international relations. And thus my first question to John Mearsheimer is the following. Are we heading for a big war? Actually, this idea is also quite popular in Russia and beyond Russia, and many scholars are comparing the current situation with the pre-World War I situation. Of course, we have nuclear weapons, which differentiates us from the situation that we had in early 20th century. But nevertheless, if these rules of international relations are unchangeable, if this fight for hegemony is unchangeable and eternal, and the U.S.-Russian relations already now are balancing on the brink of outright use of force, be it in Syria or beyond Syria, are we really on the eve of World War III or whatever? Are we really heading for a new war among great powers? What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, because of the presence of nuclear weapons, it's virtually impossible to have a war that looks anything like either World War I or World War II. In both of those world wars, there was a decisive victory. Germany was decisively defeated in World War I and in World War II, and Japan was decisively defeated in World War II. There's no way that the United States could decisively defeat a country like Russia or a country like China that has thousands of nuclear weapons. It's just not in the game. So if you're going to have a war that involves the United States on one hand and a country like China on the other hand, it's going to be a limited war. And if it's not a limited war, everybody's going to get incinerated. Because if both sides were to launch all of their nuclear weapons, there would not be much left. So my view is that when you have great powers in the system, there's no question that they compete with each other and that they compete with each other intensely. And there's no doubt that there's a danger of war. But I don't think a war like World War I or World War II is possible. So that'd be my first point. My second point is, despite all of the bad blood between Russia and the United States today, I don't think the most likely conflict is between those two countries. I think the most likely conflict is between the United States and China. And the reason is that ultimately Russia is not a serious threat to the United States. The United States has pursued a very foolish policy towards Russia since at least the year 2000. And I believe, as many of you know, that the United States is principally responsible, or to put it more generally, the West is principally responsible for causing the Ukraine crisis. But nevertheless, the Russians and the Americans have no good reasons to be competing with each other in a serious way. And in fact, the Americans should be cooperating with the Russians against the Chinese. And the reason for that is that the Chinese are, China is potentially a very powerful country. China is a potential peer competitor to the United States. China is going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere if it continues to grow. When Hillary Clinton said in 2011 that the United States was pivoting to Asia, what she was really saying is, we're going to pivot to Asia and we're going to pivot away from Europe, because Europe no longer matters that much to the United States, and Asia does. And the reason is, there's no country in Europe, including Germany and including Russia, that is a serious threat to American interests. In contrast, there is a country in Asia that is a serious potential threat to the United States, and that's China. So, I believe that if there is a great power war in the future, number one, it will not be a total war like World War I or World War II. It will be a limited war over something like the South China Sea, Taiwan, or the East China Sea. And it will involve China, not Russia.
That's very interesting. Thank you for your response, Dr. Mearsheimer. My only concern is that as of now, the United States is trying to pursue a liberal-centric foreign policy aimed at strengthening the so-called US-led liberal hegemonic order, which is challenged by Russia. And is viewing Russia as a challenger. But what you are talking about is quite similar to the philosophy, to some instinctive points that Donald Trump is making in his presidential campaign today. He's more adversarial towards China, viewing China as the threat and rival to the United States #1. He is less aggressive and more friendly and constructive towards Russia, perhaps because he also thinks instinctively, perhaps, that Russia should join the United States in countering the Chinese rise. But nevertheless, one of close colleagues of yours, I mean Stephen Walt, with whom you used to publish several books and articles, he claims that Donald Trump makes the discourse in the United States worse rather than better, and actually prevents from a serious discussion and reform of the U.S. foreign policy. How can you explain that, and when can we anticipate, if any, the U.S. foreign policy discourse departing from the current liberal consensus and moving towards what you are talking about?
Yeah, just to be clear here, if you think about what American foreign policy has been all about since the end of the Cold War. This goes back to 1989. We meaning the Americans, have been deeply interested in global domination. We've wanted to dominate the entire globe. Almost everybody in the American foreign policy establishment believes that the United States is the indispensable nation, that it stands taller and it sees further than any other country on the planet. And if we can create a situation where the United States is in a position to basically run the world, that will be a much more peaceful world, a much more prosperous world, and in general, it'll be much better for everybody else. So the American foreign policy establishment, whether you're talking about Republicans or Democrats, is deeply committed to global domination. And this is actually a very liberal foreign policy. It's a very liberal way of thinking about the world, because what we want to do is we want to spread democracy, we want to spread capitalism, and we want to take these institutions that we built during the Cold War, and we want to spread these institutions all over the planet. Just think about what's happened in Europe in the run-up to the Ukraine crisis. What the West, here we're talking really about the United States, was trying to do was take these institutions like NATO and the European Union that had dominated Western Europe during the Cold War and move them eastward right up to the Russian border. That's what NATO expansion in 1999, NATO and EU expansion in 2004 were all about. It was expanding that liberal order. And in the process of doing this, right, we fought numerous wars. I don't know how many of you realize this, but the United States has fought 7 wars since the Cold War ended. The present war against ISIS is our 7th war. We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. This is what liberal hegemony or global domination is all about. Now, there are a number of people in the United States, Steve Walt is one, I'm another, who think this is foolish. In case you haven't noticed, we lose almost all these wars. We create crises, such as the Ukraine crisis. This is, in my opinion, a losing foreign policy, this liberal policy aimed at dominating the globe. And what people like Steve and I are calling for is restraint, trying to remain the most powerful country on the planet for sure, but not try to dominate the world and constantly stick your nose in other countries' business and tell them how to run their domestic politics. We want restraint. It's hard to make that argument in the United States because, as I said to you before, the foreign policy establishment is so deeply committed to global domination. Along comes Donald Trump. Donald Trump instinctively is opposed to global domination. He's more interested in restraint. So there are some parallels between what Trump is pushing and what people like Steve Walt, Barry Posen, and myself are arguing. However, it's important to emphasize that we disagree with Trump on all sorts of issues, and none of us would vote for Trump. I want to be very clear on that. But with regard to American foreign policy, there are some powerful similarities in our views, or some important similarities in our views. But the problem is that Trump gives our views a bad name because so many people in the foreign policy establishment are axiomatically opposed to anything he says, and therefore they're opposed by definition to our ideas about the importance of restraint. So I think this is what Steve was talking about when he said that Donald Trump has made it harder for people of our persuasion to make the case for a more restrained foreign policy.
But is this restraint-based foreign policy possible in the longer-term prospect in the United States, or what will it take and how will it cost for the United States to move towards that kind of foreign policy? Is it possible to move towards that model that you promote in a more peaceful way, or the United States will be compelled to go through a series of crises? Maybe you've mentioned 7 wars. Maybe it will take the United States 14 wars or 21 wars before it finally before it finally becomes compelled to pursue a normal great power foreign policy.
I think to answer your question is it's important to focus on China. Mm-hmm. Everything depends on China. If China continues to rise, the United States will be forced to focus on containing China, and it will be much more difficult for the United States to pursue global domination and fight wars in the Middle East and cause trouble with the Russians, because China is potentially so powerful that the United States will just have to pay deadly serious attention to China and behave in very strategic and calculating ways. If, on the other hand, China does not continue to grow in an impressive way, let's say the Chinese economy flatlines, or the Chinese economy actually begins to decline over time, then I believe the United States will be more powerful relative to all of the other countries on the planet in the year 2050 than it is now. And if the United States is more powerful relative to every other major country in the world in 2050 than it is today, it will continue to pursue global domination. And the main reason that the United States can pursue this foolish policy is that, number one, it's incredibly rich. Number two, it is an incredibly secure country. For geographical reasons, the United States is very safe. And number three, it's built a military force that allows it to intervene all around the world and not alienate the American public. If we had a draft, if the United States had a draft and they had to get kids off of the street and put them in the military to go fight these wars, which is what happened during the Vietnam War, we would not fight these wars. But we have a very small, all-volunteer military that represents a narrow slice of the society, and that military, for some reason, is willing to fight these wars year after year after year. And furthermore, the United States relies on drones and its Air Force. It relies on high technologies to fight these conflicts, which means that the average American is not paying a significant price for these conflicts. So for those different reasons, the United States will continue to pursue global domination if there's no China threat to deal with. If, on the other hand, there's a China threat, the United States will have a very different foreign policy. It will be focused on China, and it will pay much less attention to fighting wars in the Middle East and causing trouble in Eastern Europe.
But this brings me back to the tragedy of great power politics, because if the United States is pursuing a China-centric foreign policy, it does not make the international system in general more safe and secure, because it will be the policy of containment. Yes, the U.S. will not pursue the classical liberal policy of global domination, but it will try to contain China. Basically, are you talking about a Cold War 2.0, but between the U.S. and China, and perhaps a global bipolarity? Actually, I think it is quite interesting that last year, the Valdai Club produced a report on a global bipolarity as an outlook for the balance of the 21st 21st century, and it was arguing that the United States is consolidating its allies in Europe, in Asia. You know, TTP, TTIP, stronger NATO, Asian alliances of the U.S. and the Pacific. At the same time, Russia and China are in an unprecedented partnership. There is a consolidation of Eurasia, and thus we have a parameters of this global, of this new version, of course different one, but still bipolarity, US-centric pole and Eurasia-centric pole. Are we heading for that? What do you think about this? And are we really, are the only options really either US pursuit of global hegemony or this global bipolarity in this or that way? Is there no third way? Is there no, I would say, more benign and peaceful way to accommodate great power relationships in the 21st century?
Well, first of all, I'd argue that we're not heading towards bipolarity because I believe that Russia is an independent great power. Mm-hmm. China is an independent great power, and the United States is an independent great power. And I believe, by the way, if Japan were to get nuclear weapons, it would be a great power as well, in my lexicon, right? So I believe we're entering a multipolar world, okay? Now, the second question that your comments raise has to do with the relations between Russia and China. I think what the United States and the West more generally has done is push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And I believe this is a foolish policy on the part of the United States. Given how powerful China is likely to be if it continues to grow economically, the United States has a vested interest in having Russia as an ally. And it certainly does not have a vested interest in driving the Russians into a close alliance with the Chinese, right? I do believe, however, that over time, relations between the Russians and the Americans will improve, relations between the Russians and the Chinese will deteriorate, and the Russians and the Americans will be part of a balancing coalition against China. Because I believe ultimately China will be a serious threat to Russia, and the Russians and the Americans will work together. But in the meantime, the situation,
also from a Russian point of view, because of the Ukraine crisis. The final point you made is, isn't there a third way? Is it necessary that that China and the United States compete with each other and engage in a serious security competition where there's potential for war? And my answer is that's unavoidable. This is the tragedy of great power politics. The Chinese are going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, because that's the best way to survive in the international system. And the United States, on the other hand, is going to go to great lengths to make sure that China doesn't dominate East Asia or Asia more generally. The Chinese believe that the South China Sea is basically a giant Chinese lake. The United States does not accept that for 1 second. The United States is basically protecting Taiwan. China believes that Taiwan should become part of the mainland. There are these islands in the East China Sea that the Japanese think belong to them and the Chinese think belong to them. The United States will side with the Chinese. With the Japanese against the Chinese. So you have all sorts of potential for conflict there, and you're going to have a great power competition, in my opinion, between the United States and China that bears some resemblance to the competition you had between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are many people who think that if you had to run the Cold War all over again, that you could do it differently, and there's no reason that the United States and the Soviet Union had to be adversaries. I think that was not possible. There was no way after 1945 that the Soviet Union and the United States were not going to become adversaries. It's, again, the tragedy of great power politics. If you're the Soviet Union after 1945, you have a deep-seated interest in dominating Europe. You have a deep-seated interest in dominating Germany. You've just fought World War I and World War II against Germany. You've just lost 24 million people in World War II. Don't you think it makes sense from a Soviet point of view to want to dominate all of Europe and make sure you dominate Germany? I think you'd be crazy not to if you were a Soviet leader. At the same time, from an American point of view, it makes absolutely no sense to allow the Soviet Union to dominate Europe. And that's why we spent 45 years during the Cold War doing everything we could to make sure the Soviets didn't dominate Europe. And by the way, before that, we fought World War II to make sure Nazi Germany didn't dominate Europe. And before that, we fought in World War I. We came into the war in April 1917 to make sure that Imperial Germany didn't dominate Europe. And that's why we'll go to great lengths to make sure that China doesn't dominate Asia. But of course, China is going to want to dominate Asia. Let me just tell you a quick story on that point. When I go to China, I occasionally say to my Chinese interlocutors, look, in the early 1980s, you decided to integrate China into the world capitalist system that was basically set up and run by the United States. The United States created this international order after World War II that allowed countries in Western Europe, allowed countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan to flourish. And in the early 80s, the Chinese decided to buy into this system. And over the course of the 1980s and the course of the 1990s, China continued to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Really, it's a wonderful situation from the Chinese point of view. So I say to the Chinese this: why don't you just accept the fact that the United States runs the world? And let us continue to run the world, and just sit back and be a part of this international economic system that we've set up and get richer and richer and richer. You're just going to become more and more prosperous. The United States is not threatening to invade China, so you don't have to worry about your security. And we'll take care of your security needs in East Asia. You know, we've done a wonderful job since 1945 maintaining security in East Asia. So let us just continue to do that. Right? I have never met a single Chinese person who accepts that argument. Chinese do not want the Americans providing security for them. Chinese do not want the United States dominating the international institutions around the world. The Chinese believe those institutions need to be revised to take into account the rise of China. They believe that new institutions run by China have to be created. And they believe that pushing the United States military out of East Asia and allowing China to dominate East Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere is what's necessary. So what you see is this inevitable competition between a rising China and an America that is a jealous God. And we'll go to great lengths to make sure it doesn't get pushed out of East Asia.
You know, of course, the United States can't allow China to dominate East Asia and can't allow Russia to dominate Europe. What about Russia's domination of the post-Soviet space? Usually the US accuses Russia of the intent to dominate post-Soviet space, to rebuild an empire, and so on. And historically, at least in the 20th century, the US perception was that Russian domination of the post-Soviet space is a threat to the United States because it creates an independent power center. But today, China, as you rightly say, has emerged as a real rival to the United States. So what about the US perception of Russian domination of the post-Soviet space? Can it change towards a more neutral one?
What's very interesting is before the Ukraine crisis broke out, really on February 22nd, 2014, that's when you had the coup against Yanukovych. Before then, nobody in the West was arguing that Russia was a threat to conquer territory in its western border, on its western borders. Nobody was arguing that Russia was going to invade Ukraine or invade the Baltic states. And in fact, if anybody was, in a sense, increasing its influence in those areas that were once controlled by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, it was the United States and its European allies. In 1999, you had NATO, the first tranche of NATO expansion. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became part of NATO. In 2004, the Baltic states, which border Russia, right, Bulgaria, Romania, so forth and so on, they became part of NATO. The EU also began to expand. So it was not the Russians who were moving westward, it was the West that was moving eastward.
Yeah. And in 2008, NATO claimed that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO.
That was the big mistake that the West made. It was a bridge too far, right? And that was what precipitated, that's the main precipitating cause. Let me put it differently. That's the deep cause of the present crisis, right? Because the Russians were not going to let that happen. And from a Russian point of view, it makes perfect sense. I don't know what the Americans were thinking or what the West Europeans were thinking when they thought that they could drive NATO right up to include Georgia and Russia. That was a huge mistake. But again, I want to emphasize to you that when the United States and the West Europeans were talking about expanding NATO to include Georgia and Russia, they were not doing it because they thought that Russia had to be contained. They did not think that Putin was highly aggressive and that the Russian military was poised to conquer territory in Eastern Europe. In fact, the Russians had remarkably few military units in the Western military districts that could have conquered territory, right? It was after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, after the crisis broke out, that all of a sudden everybody started arguing that Putin was determined to recreate the Soviet Union or create a greater Russia, and people were beginning to allude to the fact that he looked like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. This, of course, is ridiculous. What Putin was mainly doing was defensive, and it was defensively oriented. He was making sure that NATO did not include Georgia, the war, August 2008, and Ukraine after February 2014. So I don't think there's any real potential for Russia to reconquer territory in Eastern Europe. And by the way, if the Russians try to reconquer territory in Eastern Europe, it's going to be like going into Afghanistan or going into Iraq. If you really want to wreck Russia, I say this in the United States, if you really want to wreck Russia, encourage it to try and conquer territory in Eastern Europe. See how well that works out. You've seen how well the United States has done in Afghanistan. You've seen how well we've done in Iraq. That's what happens when you occupy countries in the age of nationalism. You get yourself into big trouble.
Just to finish the topic with Russia-Western relations, let me quote a realist practitioner in the United States, namely Thomas Graham, the former Russia advisor to George W. Bush, who claimed in his latest article in Foreign Policy magazine that the tragedy of the US politics towards Russia is that American establishment has only two options acceptable in terms of their relations with Russia. Option number one is Russia's full integration into the West as a regional power, as a junior power, and option two is complete defeat or final defeat of Russia. And of course, none of the options is acceptable for us. And the model of thinking that you just described in China, that hegemonic stability theory is not applicable to US-Chinese relations, it is also not applicable to Russian-Chinese relations. But before moving to the questions from the audience, let me ask you one last question on the regional politics, of course, with global repercussions, and namely, regional politics and regional situation in the Middle East. I know you are also giving one of your lectures in GIMO is about the future in the broader Middle East. And in our perception, we are just in the beginning of a pervasive destabilization there. What's your take? What is the future of the Middle East? And can great powers like the US, Europeans, Russia, China contribute to stabilization of the situation there, also taking into account the tragedy of great power politics and competition among them?
Well, this is an enormously complicated subject because the Middle East is a variety of different countries, and it's very hard to sort of generalize. I think if you look at America's performance in the Middle East since 2001, and of course the United States has focused its foreign policy on the Middle East since 2001, we have certainly not contributed to peace and prosperity. In fact, what we've done is helped create a huge amount of death and destruction. If you look at what we did to Iraq, if you look at the role we've played in breaking apart Syria, if you look at what happened in Libya, if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, it is a pretty sad record. The United States has not been very successful. Now, one could argue that the United States could have done it differently and been more successful. I actually think that's not true. I think that if the United States or Russia or China want to get deeply involved in the Middle East and they want to make things better and they want to promote stability, basically you end up doing social engineering. And social engineering, in my opinion, leads to untold trouble. I think if you're the United States, the best thing to do is stay out of the Middle East. Let people there figure out for themselves how to run their politics. And from an American point of view, the main thing is to make sure that no one country controls all of the oil. That's long been America's principal goal in that region of the world. And that should be our main goal. We should keep most of our military forces offshore. We should have a rapid deployment force. If we have to go in for one reason or another, we can go in, take care of the business, and then pull the forces out. But we should not have large numbers of American troops in the Middle East. We should not pursue anything like the Bush Doctrine. You all understand that the Bush Doctrine was designed to democratize.
Он решил демократизировать Ближний Восток. Это была очень глупая ошибка. Никто не думал, что США используют свои военные силы для того, чтобы демократизировать Ближний Восток. Это была очень большая ошибка. И поэтому я не являюсь сторонником, чтобы крупные мощные державы участвовали в конфликтах. Сейчас Россия участвует в войне в Сирии. Я думаю, что Соединенные американцы и русские работают вместе. И, возможно, они могли бы как-то затушить эту войну. Но здесь нет никаких очевидных фактов, что они... Мне кажется, это бесконечный конфликт. Поэтому не очень хорошая ситуация в Сирии. Асад. Лучше бы нам было не идти на Ближний Восток. Нет никакой причины начать войну, нет никакой причины. Не было никаких причин убивать Каддафи. И, конечно, ситуация в Дамаске, это все закончилось огромным количеством смертей и разрушений. Поэтому я думаю, что умная, мощная держава пытается избежать таких вторжений и конфликтов. В 1971 году, когда Советский Союз, в 1982 году, когда Советский Союз вошел в Афганистан, большая часть американского истеблишмента думали, что Советский Союз хочет вторжения и завоевания. Я как раз думал, что с американской точки зрения самое лучшее это как прыгнуть в большую торпеду. И через 10 лет потерпели поражение. С вашей точки зрения, все, что лучше, что могло произойти, это было не вторгаться во Вьетнам. Вы помните, что было во Вьетнаме? Это полное было поражение для Соединенных Штатов. И вы провоцируете, вы просто держитесь в стороне от этого конфликта. И вы можете завязнуть там навсегда и потерпеть поражение. Как это я говорил и китайцам в Пекине, и говорю американцам, они будут всегда там. Если не убрать войска, то это нанесет вред американской экономике. Мы тратим от 4 до 6 триллионов долларов. От 4 до 6 триллионов долларов. И 2 войны мы проиграли. Это сумасшествие. Поэтому пытайтесь...
Thank you very much, Dr. Mearsheimer. Now let's turn to the questions from the audience. I'm sure there are, because we're having a really thrilling discussion, and we're having this unique opportunity of having the Living Classics classic with us. Please go ahead. But introduce yourself.
Of course. My name is Nikolai Shevchenko. I'm correspondent for Russia Beyond the Headlines. I have an impression that a lot of people in the United
Curry.
With the United States, as well as people in Russia, are looking for a change of leadership in the United States in the hope that it will fix their relations. So my question would be, to what extent do you think U.S.-Russia relations depend on who is in charge in Washington and Moscow? And is it fair enough to hope for a change if the leadership changes? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that leaders matter, but not very much. And I think that whether Putin is the president or Medvedev or whoever, it doesn't matter very much. The Russian foreign policy establishment is going to be deeply opposed to NATO expansion into Ukraine and into Georgia, no matter what. And as you know, Gorbachev and Yeltsin were screaming about NATO expansion in the 1990s. Gorbachev and Yeltsin were opposed to NATO expansion. The idea that there's going to be a Russian leader somewhere down the road who's going to tolerate NATO expansion into Ukraine and Georgia is a pipe dream. I mean, many Americans think that, right? I wrote this very controversial piece on the Ukraine crisis in Foreign Affairs, and in the letters that followed up, Michael McFaul, who had been the ambassador to Moscow, basically blamed it all on Putin. And the idea is that Putin hadn't been president, we wouldn't have had this crisis. And as I said in my response, I thought this is simply wrong. It places much too much emphasis on Putin. Nevertheless, I do believe that you can have a more or less adept or clever leader. I think that Putin is quite adept at conducting foreign policy. He's experienced, he knows what he's doing, he has good instincts, right? And it is possible you could have another person running Russian foreign policy who's not as competent as Putin. And I think the same basic logic applies on the American side. I think whether you get a Republican or a Democrat, it's not going to matter very much, because there's not much difference in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats on almost all foreign policy issues. I sometimes refer to the Republicans and the Democrats as Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right? They just look a lot alike. Now, you could argue that Trump is unusual. This gets back to our earlier discussion. But the truth is, if Trump were to win, and he's not going to win, but if he were going to win, Trump would be constrained by the foreign policy establishment, by the deep state, by Congress, by the media. in terms of what he could do. And Trump would end up looking not much different than Hillary will end up looking when she replaces Barack Obama. You know, there's a very interesting essay you should all read in the Atlantic Monthly by Jeffrey Goldberg. He interviewed Barack Obama, a series of interviews with Barack Obama. And it's very clear from the interview that Obama thinks that American foreign policy is screwed up in a lot of important ways. And he describes a number of different ways of thinking about how to do foreign policy. But what's interesting is that when Obama actually executed American foreign policy, he didn't do it in a different way. He did it the traditional way. Obama was in an iron cage. He had hardly any maneuver room to execute foreign policy according to his basic instincts, right? He was really limited because he was surrounded by this foreign policy community in Washington that put great constraints on him. And this is reflected in the Goldberg interview. He's basically telling Goldberg how foreign policy should have been conducted by him, not how he actually conducted it. Right? So again, if Donald Trump were to win, which I believe is not going to happen, he would behave pretty much the way Hillary will behave, because I think she will be elected. Right? So there's not much maneuver room in the American context. And my point to you about the Russian context, there's not much maneuver room there either.
Just a small footnote to what John Mearsheimer just said. There is, I think, something more in McFaul's statement that it's all about Putin than just a wrong analysis. This is an indication that we are in a systemic clash, in a systemic confrontation, because this argument is absolutely the same, is very much similar to the argument that was made by George Kennan in late 1940s in the United States in his article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, that it is the internal nature of the Soviet Union which compels the USSR to behave in a belligerent and aggressive way, and there is no alternative for the US to conduct a containment policy. The same, absolutely the same argument is made by McFaul and others like Ivo Daalder and other American liberal internationalists nowadays in the US, and this is one of the similarities between the Cold War and nowadays, unfortunately. Oleg Barabanov, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Oleg Barabanov from the Valdai Club and GIMO University, both institutions welcoming here in Moscow. And my question is also about the next US presidency. What you've said about the bad image that Donald Trump gave to your ideas about Russia, China, US triangle and the division of powers in this triangle. It's also the case not only for your ideas, but for the Russian foreign policy as well, because now if you see our media, our TV discussions, the majority of people are in favor of Trump, and majority of people here is thinking that if Trump wins, all the relations with the United States finally became better, and finally we follow maybe your receipts and your logic. But if no, and you are quite sure that there will be not Donald Trump, your next president, so what could be some practical measures to counterbalance this internal logic within the American foreign policy establishment now, that now we have to punish Russia. Let's forget about China, let's postpone China for some decade, and let's punish Russia now. And it will strengthen, by the way, the Russian-Chinese strategic alliance for sure. Mm-hmm. So what would be your countermeasures at the level of foreign policy intellectuals and the levels of foreign policy lobbying within Washington to somehow stop this?
I simply don't have a good answer to that. I wish I did. I mean, the consensus in Washington or to put it in more general terms, the consensus inside the foreign policy establishment on Russia is so powerful that it is almost impossible for people like me, people like Steve Cohen, people like Steve Walt to challenge. I mean, you can challenge it, but it's hard to have much of a voice. And even if you have some voice, it seems like not many people are willing to listen. Therefore, I'm not sure there's much the Russians can do, or Americans who'd like to change the situation can do. For a long time, I thought the real hope with the West Europeans, that they would put pressure on the Americans to see that this is not a smart way to do business. But the West Europeans are very reluctant to stand up to the Americans. They tend to take their orders from the Americans. This is especially true of the Germans. And this has a lot to do with history, World War II, the Cold War. And as you notice, things with regard to the French have even begun to deteriorate recently. And the French were in many ways Russia's best friend in Western Europe. So I don't hold out much hope that the West Europeans can push the Americans to change their thinking. My view, as I tried to make clear before, was that the real hope is that China continues to rise and the United States realizes that engaging in this sort of hostile relationship with Russia makes absolutely no strategic sense at all. And therefore we begin to backtrack and relations begin to improve. But short of the rise of China, it's very difficult to see how this situation is rectified. I wish I had a good answer. See, here's the basic problem. The basic problem is that, number one, the Russians stood up to the United States. Right? This is just unacceptable to the indispensable nation. Right? The United States thinks that other countries have to do what we say they should do. And if they don't, we get very angry, right? Because we are the indispensable nation. And we're interested in global domination. And we got away with it for quite a while with regard to Russia. This is the point that I made to you about the first two tranches of NATO expansion. We got away with it. But then after April 2008, the Bucharest summit, right, things went south. And they've continued to go south. And the Russians have no intention of caving in to the Americans. The Russians are going to continue to stand up to the Americans, and they're going to form close relations with the Chinese. The second reason that the Americans are so angry with the Russians is that the Russians have actually been very successful at challenging the Americans. It's not only that the Russians are standing up to us, they've been so successful. Think about Syria. What did Barack Obama say was going to happen to Russia in Syria? He said that Russia was going to end up in a quagmire. It was going to be a losing war. Well, that may ultimately be true. I'm not saying it will be, but it may be. But there's no evidence that the Russians are headed in that direction. And it actually looks like the Russians are doing very well in Syria, and that Russian influence in the Middle East is growing. At the same time, American influence is diminishing. This enrages the Americans. Then there's the whole question of sanctions. The Americans and the West Europeans thought they could put sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. This would do great damage to the Russian economy. Putin would throw up his hands and say, I surrender. Well, that hasn't happened. So you have this situation where the United States is dealing with a country, Russia, that one is standing up to it, and two, doing very well, by the way. And this enrages the foreign policy establishment, to include the media. And the end result is we have this terrible situation where relations between the two countries are deteriorating when there's no reason, at least in my opinion, for that to be the case. And indeed, there's good reason for the United States to have very positive relations with Russia.
Yes, please.
I am Victoria Vanchenko, Editor-in-Chief of Creative Diplomacy and as well representative of High School of Economics. My question concerns Ukrainian case, and first part of my question is, does what real interest does the United States have in Ukraine now? And
That's a great question.
and another question is, what most rational foreign policy to Ukraine should be pursued by the United States now concerning all this anti-Russian rhetorics in Ukraine, fully dependence on Western support, and so on? Thank you.
Yeah. With regard to your first question, what's the American interest in Ukraine? It is very clear from what happened after February 22nd, 2014, that Ukraine is not of vital strategic interest for the United States. Nor was Georgia, as we demonstrated in August of 2008. The United States was not willing to fight for Ukraine. It was not willing to fight for Georgia. That means that those two countries are not vital strategic interests. Right? And of course, from a Russian point of view, Ukraine and Georgia are vital strategic interests. That's why the Russians are not going to throw their hands up. They'll suffer under sanctions if need be. Right? So the balance of resolve between Russia on one hand and the United States on the other hand, the balance of resolve favors the Russians because, again, Ukraine and Georgia are core strategic interests. This raises the fascinating question, why was the United States interested in extending NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia, which were two countries that it was unwilling to fight over? As you know, NATO contains the famous Article 5 guarantee, which says that if a country that's a member of NATO is attacked, you will countenance going to war to defend that country. Well, we've already demonstrated that we wouldn't fight over Ukraine and we wouldn't fight over Georgia, so why would we give them an Article 5 guarantee? It just makes no strategic sense at all. And it just shows you how remarkably foolish American foreign policy was. And of course, the reason we were willing to give them an Article 5 guarantee, both Georgia and Ukraine, is we thought we'd never have to fight a war, because we thought that the Russians would never cause any trouble in either one of those countries, right? But anyway, the answer to your question is, we don't have a vital strategic interest in Ukraine or in Georgia. Now, second question you ask is, what can we do to solve the problem? I've actually believed from the beginning that there's a simple solution to this problem, and that is to create a neutral Ukraine, right, that is not pro-West, that is not part of any Russian alliance. It's a neutral Ukraine that's a giant buffer state between NATO on one side and the Russians on the other. And then what should happen is that the Russians, the EU, the World Bank, the IMF, and the United States should all get together and work to create a prosperous Ukraine. And by the way, I do believe that Putin wanted to do this before the February 22nd, 2014 crisis. I think the Russians have a deep-seated interest in having an economically prosperous Ukraine on their border. A neutral Ukraine for sure, but an economically prosperous one. If it's economically prosperous, it's not going to threaten Russia. And from an economic point of view, it'll be to Russia's benefit. So let's neutralize Ukraine. Let's create a situation where the Russians in the Donbass area have considerable autonomy, where there's no legislation outlawing the Russian language, and so forth and so on, and then work to make Ukraine an economically prosperous state. And I think that would solve the problem. I think the chances of that happening are basically zero at this point in time, because relations between Russia and Ukraine are so poisoned, and relations between the United States and Ukraine are so poisoned. Just to flip over to Syria, I mean, from a humanitarian point of view, look, we ought to work with the Russians. The Americans ought to work with the Russians. The Russians ought to work with the Americans to shut this war down immediately. This is a humanitarian disaster of the first order, and it shows no signs of abating, right? From a purely humanitarian point of view, we ought to shut it down. But we're incapable of working with the Russians. The Russians are incapable of working with us. The relations between the two countries are just pure poison. And what does that mean for Syria? It's bad news. What does that mean for Ukraine? It's bad news. So we're in a real mess.
Let's go to that side and then we'll come back here.
My name is Alexander Maryasov. I'm ambassador retired.
You're what?
Ambassador retired.
Okay.
I served in Iran and Taiwan as ambassador. Mr. Mearsheimer, if you, as you say, Russia is not a serious threat to the United States, and if United States adhere to a liberal approach in international relations, why it is so difficult to reach mutually acceptable decisions and compromises on a number of very serious issues, such as in Syria, be it in Ukraine, be it in our bilateral relations? Thank you.
Well, I believe that Russia is a country that plays by the realist playbook. And I believe that the United States, for most of the post-Cold War period, has operated according to a different playbook, the liberal playbook. So when NATO expansion first surfaced as an issue in the mid-1990s, the realists in the United States said, and George Kennan was one of the most prominent voices in this regard, the realists said NATO expansion is a prescription for really big trouble, because the idea that you can take a military alliance that was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union and march it up to Russia's border is asking for big trouble. Because the Russians are going to be playing according to a realist playbook, and they are going to see that as a threat, okay? But in the United States, the realists lost the debate, and the liberal internationalists won. And their view was that great power politics of the sort that I described, the realist worldview, had been put on the scrap heap of history. Liberal internationalists who dominated American foreign policy believed that people like me are dinosaurs, or to use John Kerry's terminology, we're products of the 18th century, okay? We're old think, right? We live in a world of new think. Liberal internationalism, where the United States, this benign hegemon, can take NATO, can take the EU, right, and push eastward right up to the Russian border, and the Russians will accept it because they understand that realpolitik is dead. You talk to Michael McFaul, right? I've debated Michael McFaul. I've engaged with him in foreign affairs. You talk to Michael McFaul, who is a thoroughgoing liberal internationalist who believes that people like me are dinosaurs, right? And he will tell you, I told Putin, I told his lieutenants that NATO expansion was not a threat to them. And I would say to him, and what did Putin say? And he would tell you that Putin said that's not true. It is a threat to us. But I would explain to him again, it's not a threat. Now what's going on there? Michael McFaul is not interested in expanding NATO eastward to contain Russia. He does not believe that Russia is going to conquer Ukraine or that Russia is ready to jump into the Baltic states. He's a liberal internationalist who wants to spread this liberal international order further and further eastward. And he will tell you, ultimately, it's possible that Russia could become part of this liberal international order. So he's not thinking like a good realist. In fact, he's dismissing realism. But the problem, from his point of view, is that on the other side is Vladimir Putin and the Russian foreign policy establishment, which is playing by the realist playbook and sees NATO and the EU as a mortal threat. for a realist like me, great powers are very sensitive about their neighborhood, about their borders. They do not like other great powers getting close to them. You know, we have the Monroe Doctrine. You surely know about the Monroe Doctrine. The United States does not want any distant great power coming into the Western Hemisphere. You remember what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis? The United States was apoplectic about the idea that the Soviets were moving missiles into Cuba. This is right next door to us. This is unacceptable. Well, doesn't that same logic apply to the Russians? Don't you think the Russians are going to be scared as NATO marches eastward? No, they're not, according to liberal internationalists, because great power politics is dead. Well, it was dead for them, but it wasn't dead for the Russians. And the end result is you got this crisis. So as remarkable as it may seem, I think that's exactly what happened.
Actually, coming back to what you said before, power politics can revive in the United States if the other powers, especially China, rise to the level that the United States face this this threat.
Just to pick up on your point very quickly, I sometimes refer to the period
gives
from
our views a bad
1989
name.
up to the present in the United States as a holiday from realism.
Yes. Please.
My name is Igor Delanoë. I'm deputy head of the French-Russian Analytical Center at the French-Russian Chamber of Commerce. Many thanks for
Allow
sharing
the
your
Soviet
views
Union to
with us
dominate
today.
Europe. That's
My
why we
question
spent
touches
45
down
years during
Syria.
the Cold War doing everything
Could you
we could
please
to make
elaborate
sure
a
the
little
Soviet
bit more on Syria and and in your views, what are today U.S. goals and interests in Syria concretely, and
Ian,
what
we're
sort
talking
of
about
shifts could be
expanding
expected
NATO
from
to
the new
include-
U.S. administration with regard to the Syrian crisis? Thank you.
Well, I mean, just a number of different points on Syria. I think, and I've written on this, the United States has no strategic interests in Syria. Syria is of little strategic importance to the United States. What the United States cares about in the Middle East is oil. And the countries that matter to us strategically are countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and so forth and so on, countries that have a lot of oil. Syria has no oil. It's not a great power. Who cares who's running Syria? Syria is no threat to the United States, nor is Egypt for that matter. Syria and Egypt, and the same is true of Israel, by the way. These are not countries that matter to the United States in the sense that they're core strategic interests. They're just not. What we were doing there, I don't fully understand. As I said before, the United States played a key role in precipitating this war. Right? The crisis broke out in March 2011. In August of 2011, Obama said that Assad had to go, and we've played an important role working with the Saudis, working with the Turks, and working with the Qataris to topple the regime. Okay, we failed, and now that the Russians are in defending the regime, along with the Iranians and Hezbollah, Assad is not going anywhere, right? So the idea that we're going to get rid of Assad is not in the cards. What does that mean? What that means is if we don't accept the fact that Assad is here to stay, and we don't work with the Russians to prop up Assad and defeat ISIS and stabilize Syria, the war is just going to go on and on and on. And it's going to be, in effect, a proxy war. So I find it hard to see how the situation in Syria is going to improve anytime soon unless the Americans do an about-face and accept the fact that Assad is here to stay, and that for humanitarian reasons, the best thing we can do is work with the Russians, as painful as that may be, to prop up Assad and just shut the war down. And that's going to mean not only going after ISIS in
conjunction with the Russians and with the Assad government, it's going to mean going after the jihadis too, many of whom we're supporting either directly or indirectly. It's hard to tell for sure, right? So the question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is it that we'll do that? Well, Hillary Clinton looks like she's going to win for sure. As I've said on a number of occasions, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States. Hillary Clinton is. Hillary Clinton is more hawkish on Syria than Barack Obama is. And she's surrounded by hawks on the Syrian issue. These are not the sort of people who I think are going to work with the Russians and with the Assad government to deal with ISIS and the jihadis. So it seems to me, I hope I'm wrong. God, I hope I'm wrong, given the humanitarian disaster we're talking about here. I hope I'm wrong in that we do an about face and we work with the Russians. But I don't see that happening.
Yes, please.
Nina Ilina, Ведомости Business Daily, Foreign Affairs. Two short questions to you. First is, you've said today and in your works, in your books, that great power should stay out of the conflicts in far regions, right? And you also laid out some strategies how countries could act in those conflicts. So when you analyzed conflicts, could you bring any, from your point of view, successful examples still when a great power invades another country? And what should be successful strategy? For example, some present bombings in Yugoslavia or Gulf War in 1991 as kind of successful. Could you agree on that? So the first question is, if a foreign country invades another one, what should be the successful strategy? And the second, you just elaborated quite a lot on American strategy in Syria. So, well, about Russian, you said it has great policy there. At the same time, it's the biggest disaster, some say, since the Second World War. From your point of view, how much does Russia control what's going on in Syria? How successful is its strategy? It's a very difficult situation there. So what do you think of it? Thank you.
Yeah. The first question that you asked had to do with what now?
Well, any examples of last 20, 30 years?
Good. Yeah. Look, where you get into trouble when you go into developing countries, when you go into small countries in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, is when you topple the government for the purposes of replacing it with a government that is friendly to you. It's when you get into the business of social engineering, okay? This is what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. It's what happened to the Americans in Afghanistan. It's what happened to the Americans in Iraq. It's what happened to the Americans in Libya, right? And it's what's happening in Syria. A country like the United States or Russia can invade another country and defeat its army, right? And then get out and be successful. Take the first Iraq War in 1991. Yeah. Iraq invaded and conquered Kuwait. The United States said to the Iraqis, leave. They did not leave, and the United States went to war. We smashed the Iraqi army, we pushed them out of Kuwait, and we did not invade Iraq. There was pressure to invade Iraq, but we did not invade Iraq because the United States in 1991 was smart enough to know that if you went to Baghdad and you toppled Saddam, to put it in Colin Powell's words, you owned Iraq. And you then had to do social engineering. And that would have been big trouble. So the first Gulf War, the first Iraq War in 1991 was a great success. We threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait. We liberated Kuwait. And we did not get involved in regime change. Right? So it is possible for a country like the United States or a country like Russia to invade another country and win a military victory. It's when you get into the business of nation building or state building or social engineering more generally that you get into trouble,
right? And that's what I was saying before to you folks, that my view is that if you're involved in a great power competition, the name of the game is to get your adversary to invade another country and do social engineering, or try to do social engineering. So that'd be my answer to your first question. Regarding to your second question, about the Russians in Syria, I'd make 2 points. First of all, the Russians came to the game late, right? The Russians entered Syria, I think, in September of last year, September 2015, right? And as I said to you before, the trouble broke out in March 2011. Obama was saying that Assad had to go in the late summer of 2011. And then in 2012, we were moving towards fueling the insurgency because we thought we could topple Assad very easily. So the Russians had very little to do with creating this problem. The Russians came in when it looked like Assad was going to be toppled from power. And the Russians didn't want that to happen because Assad is an ally, and Syria is the one country in the Middle East where the Russians continue to have a lot of influence. So the Russians moved in. Now, the question you ask is, how much influence do the Russians have? Well, the Russians can keep Assad in power, and the Russians can do a lot to fight against the jihadis and to fight against ISIS. But ultimately, for this war to be shut down, for the Russians to play a key role in shutting the war down, they have to have cooperation from the United States, right? And from other countries in the region. The United States has to come in and it has to tell the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris that, no more funding the jihadis. We're going to work with the Russians. Erdogan and Putin now seem to have quite good relations. That's, possibly one way the United States can get the Turks to understand that toppling Assad is not in the cards, and maybe you could put Humpty Dumpty back together again in Syria, and basically end this humanitarian disaster. But as I said in answer to the previous question, that this gentleman asked, I just don't see the United States cooperating with the Russians, and I don't think the Russians can make great headway without cooperation from the United States. And this is just all evidence of how tragic this situation is with Washington and Moscow, the fact that we have such poisonous relations, right? And by the way, just to switch to Ukraine for a second, this situation is a disaster for Ukraine, right? I make the argument all the time that the West is leading the Ukrainians down the primrose path, right? The idea that we are continuing to tell Ukraine that it can eventually become part of the West and holding out that promise is disastrous for Ukraine. We should tell the Ukrainians, you cannot become part of the West. You have to work out some sort of deal with the Russians and some sort of deal with us, and you have to understand you can only be neutral. Telling the Ukrainians that they can become part of the West and making them more pro-Western is only going to antagonize the Russians and give the Russians even greater incentives to wreck Ukraine. This is not good for Ukraine.
We have time for one last question, so please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Antti Rauhala from the Finnish Embassy, and I would like you to elaborate on the question of NATO expansion from the point of view of smaller countries in the region, because now when you talk it from the higher level of great powers like United States and Russia, what we often forget is that most of the countries in the region actually didn't consider themselves to have NATO expanded upon them, but they actually really struggled to get into NATO and get into the European Union, and they saw themselves to be free of Soviet military occupation after Cold War. So the question is, how should United States and the West have dealt with these countries and populations?
Well,
and Finland is considering NATO membership also.
Yeah. Well, let me make a couple points. First of all, from an American point of view, the key question is, what's in the American national interest? And the Americans should only defend countries that are vital strategic interests. We should be cold and calculating about this. The United States should not be giving Article 5 guarantees to countries that are not vital strategic interests, right? So that's the first point that I'd make. Second point that I would make is I find it hardly surprising that the countries in Eastern Europe want to become part of NATO and want America to protect them. It makes perfect sense. If I was Polish, if I was Ukrainian, I'd want to be part of NATO. I understand that completely. The United States is not a threat to conquer Poland. It's not a threat to conquer Finland. It's not a threat to conquer Estonia. It's not a threat to conquer Ukraine. Russia is. We know enough history that that's obvious, right? And what all these small countries in Eastern Europe want is they want protection from Uncle Sam. And it makes perfect sense. But the problem is that in the process, you're going to make the Russians very angry. And if you're Poland, and you're much further west than Ukraine, and you're in that first tranche of countries that go into NATO in 1999, you can get away with it. The Poles got away with it. It worked. The Americans thought that defending Poland was important, and Poland got in. Then you had the second tranche, and the Baltic states got in, and a handful of other states, Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth and so on. They got in. They were lucky, right? But then Georgia and Ukraine became the focus of attention. And the Russians basically were powerful enough at that point, and those countries were close enough and big enough that the Russians said, no way that's going to happen. Now, many people say the Ukrainians have a right to determine whether or not they want to become part of NATO. Who are the Russians to say that they can't become part of the West? This is not the way international politics works. You don't have rights. Do you think the Cubans had a right to invite the Soviets to put missiles on that island in 1963? We didn't think so. We don't think countries in the Western Hemisphere have a right to invite a foreign great power into the Western Hemisphere. You don't have rights when you're dealing with the United States of America. And when you're dealing with Russia and you live right next door and you've scared the Russians, you are asking for trouble if you think you have a right to join NATO. Many Ukrainians think that way, and I wouldn't be surprised if many Finns think that way. But you want to understand that you're dealing with a great power that's scared, and it's got thousands of nuclear weapons, and you don't want to back it into a corner. I know a lot about great power politics, and scared great powers are very dangerous, right? This was not the case when Poland joined. It was not the case when Romania joined. But those days are gone. This is a new world you're in. Great power politics are back. The Russians are scared. And when you start talking about NATO expansion in that context, it's a whole different ballgame.
I can't fail to ask the very, very last question to you regarding the Valdai conference next week. It will be your first time at the Valdai conference. This conference takes place in a very, I would say, on the one hand, exceptional if we analyze it through the prism of the last 25 years, but on the other hand, normal time if we analyze it through the prism of several centuries. Yes. I mean, great power rivalry and competition. So what do you anticipate from the Valdai conference? What would you like this conference? What do you want to get from it? Just your anticipations about this conference.
Look, from 1989, when the Cold War ended, up until about 2 years ago, it was very hard to have a serious discussion about great power politics. People who talked my language in the West were considered to be dinosaurs, as I said before. Since 2014, mainly because of the Ukraine crisis, but also because of the rise of China, great power politics is back on the table. This is what you said in your introductory remarks. So if I went to the Valdai conference 5 years ago, it would have been a very different discourse than you'll get at the Valdai conference this year, or next year, or the year after. The world has just changed. And as I said, we had from 1989 up until 2014 a holiday from realism. And realism is back. So I think that what you'll get at the Valdai Conference, I'm almost certain of this, is a discussion that bears marked resemblance to the discussion that we've had here, which is the discussion I've had at McGill University and will continue to have. And it's the kind of discussion that you have even in Asia today. You know, I went to Japan for the first time in December of 2014, and a number of Japanese said to me that, how many times have you been to Japan? They would ask me, is this your third visit, your fourth visit? And I would say, no, this is my first visit to Japan. And they were actually shocked that I had never been to Japan before. And I said to them, I'm not shocked at all, because Japan has basically been what I call a peace, love, and dope country for many, many years, right? The Japanese didn't want to talk about realism. They didn't want to talk about security competition. They didn't want to talk about nuclear weapons, especially after the Soviet Union disappeared. They thought they lived in a security-rich world. The United States provided security for them, right? They had a reasonably small military and didn't have to worry about it. Then China rose, and China told the Japanese that these rocks, these islands out in the East China Sea that you, the Japanese, call the Senkaku Islands, they're actually the Diao Islands, and they're ours. They're Chinese sacred territory, and we're eventually going to take them from you. And then you've had all sorts of back and forth in the water, and the Japanese are really scared, right? Great power politics is back in Japan. So it's no accident that in December 2014, they invited Mr. Realism to Japan. And it's no accident that they have little interest in talking to me before December 2014. So I'm just saying that, you know, in the context of Japan, right, realism is back. Just one final point on this. The one country where realism has been alive and well for centuries is China, right? As I often say to people, when I go to China to talk, I usually start my talks off by saying, it's good to be back among my people. And I don't speak one word of Chinese. And culturally, I'm like a fish out of water when I'm in China. It is really a foreign culture to me. But there is no question that intellectually, I'm much more at home in China than I am in the United States. Because again, the United States is liberal internationalism gone wild. And as a realist in a liberal internationalist world, you are a fish out of water. So intellectually, I'm not at home in the United States. I'm much more at home in China. And by the way, I'm much more at home here in Russia than I would be in the United States. Culturally, I don't speak a word of Russian, right? It's a foreign culture to me, just like China's a foreign culture. But intellectually, most Russians, just like most Chinese, speak realpolitik. It's in the United States and also in Western Europe and in countries like Japan and in countries like South Korea where you see that liberal internationalist worldview has really taken hold. You go to South Korea today and there's a real schizophrenia about thinking about the Chinese threat. Especially in the business community, people who are involved in economic intercourse, they tend to be liberal internationalists in South Korea. And then the other half are the more security-oriented part of the society. And they are much more realpolitik, much more scared of China. Unlike the other side that wants to trade with China, you know, economic interdependence produces peace and so forth and so on. But I think what will happen over time is that realism will gain more and more traction. I'm not sure that's a good thing because it means a more competitive world, a more dangerous world. But again, that's the tragedy of great power politics in my story.
So if you came to the Valdai Club 5 years ago, I would tell you, welcome to the Jurassic Park. But now I'm telling you, welcome to the Jurassic world. And let's hope that this world will be not as violent as the 20th century was. So thank you very much, Dr. Mearsheimer. We really appreciate your wisdom. We really share your paradigm, and I'm looking forward to the conference next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions.